As an example, think about the apostate-driven lies and dishonesties that Jehovah's organization is permissive toward pedophiles. I mean, that is ridiculous, isn't it? If anybody takes action against someone who would threaten our young ones and takes action to protect our young ones, it's Jehovah's organization.
Other disturbing information about child abuse within the Jehovah's Witnesses. Church representatives revealed that more than 1,000 members have been identified as child sexual abusers since 1950. The Commission learned that of those hundreds of cases, none was reported to police. An elder testified that its church practiced not to report sexual abuse, but rather to adopt a scriptural response to allegations. Emma Hannigan with Australia's SBS has been following the hearing. She joins us now live from Sydney. So, Emma, this is a wide-ranging royal commission. It started with allegations of child sexual abuse, into the Catholic Church, and now it's investigating the JWs, Jehovah's Witnesses. The evidence so far has been particularly damning.
It certainly has, Joan. I mean, the Royal Commission heard that, as you said, 1950, 1,006 alleged abusers have been identified to the Jehovah's Witnesses. Now, that was 1,006 people, not 1,006 cases, so we don't know how many cases were, but none of these were reported to authorities. Instead, what the Church would do is they would investigate the claims themselves. This often involved bringing the abuser and their victims together to discuss their claims of abuse. A victim, identified only as BCB, was groomed and sexually abused by Bill Neal, a respected elder, from the age of 15. When the abuse finally emerged, she was summoned to a meeting of elder men that included her abuser. Bill Neal, who's now dead, admitted the abuse.
I found the experience of reporting my abuse to a room full of men, including the man who had abused me, very distressing.
She was also asked not to discuss the abuse with anyone else out of respect for her abuser and his family.
Thinking back, I now see that I was being asked to respect the man who had done those things to me, but nobody was offering me any respect or proper support.
The Royal Commission heard that of the 1,006 alleged abusers identified to the Jehovah's Witnesses since 1950, not one single person had been reported to police. This evidence was borne out by the testimony of one of the church elders, who himself had investigated a case of abuse.
And what about telling other authorities? Are you aware of your obligations if someone tells you of a serious allegation of sexual assault?
Well, we don't report it to the police. I think we encourage them to do that, but we give them the assistance to do that if they need that.
Church elders could now face criminal charges for concealing the abuse. The Commission also heard that the Church only believed victims if the alleged abuser confessed or there were 2 witnesses.
The requirement that there be 2 or more witnesses has prevented at least 125 allegations of child sexual abuse from proceeding to a judicial committee.
The hearing into the Jehovah's Witnesses is expected to continue for 2 weeks. The Commission heard from another elder today who also investigated BCB's case. It was told that when he was informed the woman was considering bringing her story to the Royal Commission, he asked what that would accomplish other than dragging Jehovah's name through the mud. Now, he has admitted that this wasn't perhaps the most sympathetic approach to take.
And also today, the Commission has been dealing with the actual response by church elders when young women allege that they were sexually abused by members of the church.
Well, church elder today, Joe Bellows, said that the church recommends a biblical response to the trauma caused by sexual abuse. The Commission heard from 2 abuse survivors who felt so unsupported by the church that they had both attempted suicide. Now, they say that they've never been offered any compensation, they were never offered any counselling, and the church themselves has said that perhaps this is something that they need to consider. But they certainly aren't jumping to commit to anything at the moment.
Jehovah's Witnesses have been accused of failing the victims of child sex abuse after a case in Manchester where a man who was convicted of sexual assault was allowed to cross-examine his victims. The Charity Commission, which regulates the religious group, said the questioning was inappropriate and demeaning. One victim described the meeting as worse than the court case. An audio recording of the meeting has been passed to our social affairs correspondent Michael Buchanan.
This is New Moston Kingdom Hall in Manchester, where Jonathan Rose spent years as a senior member. In 2013, he was imprisoned for 9 months after being convicted of the historical sexual abuse of young girls. Jehovah's Witnesses went to expel him, but Rose appealed, which led to an extraordinary gathering.
A meeting was called between 8 male elders, a convicted paedophile and his female victims. Over the course of an evening, the women had to recount what had happened to them, while he, Jonathan Rose, got to interrogate them.
Each woman was questioned separately. One secretly recorded her grilling by Jonathan Rose.
What I'm saying to you is this didn't happen. Give me one reason please why I would have done it to you. I had no reason to touch you, we were friends.
At one point, another man in the room asked the woman if she'd egged Rose on, and no one prevented him from discussing graphic details.
What was I supposed to have done to you that night? Please explain to me. Not to be perverted, did I touch you down below? Did I touch your breasts?
One victim said she didn't even know Rose was going to be at the Kingdom Hall. She went in the belief the congregation were going to apologise to her. We've protected her identity.
He kept making out I was lying. He kept saying, why did I make it up? Why would I say something like that? And at no point did I feel like he was going to admit it. So as soon as I knew he wasn't going to admit it, there was no remorse, no sorry. That's when I felt like I'd had enough. I just got to the point where I thought he genuinely believes he hasn't done anything wrong.
Her mother, who supported her, was appalled by what unfolded.
I felt guilty because I should have been protecting her. It shouldn't have been allowed. That meeting should not have been allowed, ever.
Jehovah's Witnesses say this evening that they have robust child protection policies and put appropriate restrictions on anyone found guilty of sexual abuse. Today's report, however, said their actions in Manchester failed the women.
It has to be dealt with in a way that is sensitive to the victims who have gone through this terrible ordeal, but also in a way that the public would expect this to be dealt with. And in this case, they let the victims down.
Though Jonathan Rose was expelled from the Kingdom Hall, the meeting here should clearly not have happened. And the Charity Commission have wider concerns about how Jehovah's Witnesses handle sex abuse allegations and are carrying out a broader inquiry.
Lurking inside this argument. When I say straw man, I obviously mean that one way of arguing, if you want to kind of undermine your opponent, is to misrepresent what their argument is, so that it's easier to break it down. So what you do is you present a slightly skewed or a misinterpretation of what their argument is that's easier to burn down, as it were, hence the straw man name. But what Stephen Lett does here is he says that the apostates say that Jehovah's organisation, Watchtower, is permissive towards pedophiles.
That Jehovah's organization is permissive toward pedophiles. I mean, that...
Now that isn't necessarily what apostates actually say. If you put policies in place that make it possible for pedophiles to abuse children without any kind of intervention from the authorities, then rather than protecting children, you're actually protecting pedophiles. Now, hopefully I don't need to explain the difference between protecting something and being permissive towards something. So if Watchtower was permissive towards pedophiles, it would be printing in its literature that it's okay to be a pedophile, more people should be pedophiles, pedophiles are receiving unwarranted criticism, you know, it's a good thing to be a pedophile. That would be being permissive, keeping tabs on pedophiles. But when you look at what Watchtower representatives have themselves said in court when under question about what their role is in protecting young ones, and to drive home this point, I'm going to show you a brief clip from Trey Bundy's excellent PBS documentary on child abuse in Jehovah's Witnesses.
And in one of the dozen lawsuits I've been following, Watchtower supervisor Richard Ashe was asked if the organization has a responsibility to protect children from abuse.
But within the congregation, ours is a spiritual protection. When we're talking about physical protection, that's up to the secular authorities to provide. And so
he was asked about the Watchtower's Bible-based directives to keep child abuse cases confidential.
It states in paragraph 3, there is a time to keep quiet when your words should prove to be few. Do you see that?
Yes, sir.
You know, Mr. Jones,
object to that. It's a violation of the First Amendment, freedom of religion, freedom of association.
So Richard Ashe, the Watchtower representative, basically says, look, it's not our responsibility to give physical protection, to physically separate young ones from pedophiles. Ours is a spiritual protection. You know, we will disfellowship a pedophile if there are the 2 witnesses in place to the wrongdoing. You know, aside from that, you know, we don't have any responsibility at all towards the physical protection of our young ones, and that's what Watchtower has said in court, and it completely contradicts what Stephen Lett has said. In particular, regarding the Jose Lopez case, listen to what Trey Bundy has to say about the way Watchtower behaved during that case.
And talk to us, you know, I don't know if we have time to go into some of the specific cases, but maybe we'll just bring up Jose Lopez. That's what we have time for now. He was molested when he was 7 years old by a Jehovah's Witness congregant in San Diego, and a judge awarded him $13.5 million when his case against the witnesses concluded in October. But, you know, how in particular was this lawsuit really able to shed light on the religion's database of predators?
This was a really important suit, and one of the reasons is because it resulted in what looks like a really rare admission. You had a Watchtower official testifying in the case that since 1997, they've directed all bodies of elders across the United States to report to the Watchtower any known child abusers. The Watchtower has been gathering this information for almost 20 years now, and the information is very detailed. It's what's the person's name? How old was the victim? Does anybody else know about this? So Erwin Zalkin, the attorney for Jose Lopez in San Diego, subpoenaed this database. The Watchtower official, a man named Richard Ashe, said that there was so much information, and it was mixed up in so many millions of documents and so many, more than 14,000 computer files, that it would take years for them to produce that information, to extract the data on all they know about child sex abusers. Zalkin brought in a software expert who testified they should be able to do it in less than 2 months. And at that point, the Watchtower essentially said, we're not going to provide this. As a result, the judge threw the Watchtower's defense out of court and issued a default judgment, $13.5 million.
Well, it's certainly incredibly disturbing stuff. Trey, thank you for...
Mr. Jeffrey Jackson, who's a member of the governing body and who's currently in Australia.
That's the governing body in New York.
That's right. So some weeks ago, it came to the attention of the Royal Commission that Mr. Jackson, a member of the governing body of the Jehovah's Witnesses in New York, was in Australia. We wrote to the lawyers acting for the Jehovah's Witnesses in Australia and asked if their client would procure a statement from Mr. Jackson and make him available as a witness. The reply that was received was that Mr. Jackson was in Australia for private, compassionate reasons, and also that since the governing body was not involved in the implementation and administration of policies and procedures in relation to child sexual abuse, he would not be able to give relevant evidence. The Royal Commission then left the matter at that point, but subsequently came to the view that Mr. Jackson's evidence would likely be useful for this hearing, particularly in relation to the formulation of policies and procedures by the governing body and the possibility for change of policies and procedures in the future. We therefore wrote last week asking whether the lawyers for the Jehovah's Witnesses in Australia would accept service of a summons on Mr. Jackson. The reply that was received reiterated that for reasons of compassion related to why Mr. Jackson was in the country, it would, as it was put, be unconscionable for him to be required to prepare to give evidence and to give evidence. Taking that into account, Mr. Jackson has not been summoned to give evidence. We would, however, welcome evidence from him or another member of the governing body, particularly with regard to the setting of policies and procedures and the possibilities for change of those policies and procedures. And the door is open for Jehovah's Witnesses in Australia or the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society of Australia to present such evidence for this hearing, including by video conference?
Yes, I think I do. But at the moment, we do not have a witness, as I understand it, who can tell us what the way forward might be to enable the Church to bring its processes into to bring its processes to the point where, rather than run the risk of increasing the trauma on those who have been abused, the processes can assist in alleviating the trauma. It is of fundamental importance to people who have been abused that when they go to the relevant authorities, and in this case it is the Church, because the Church demands a complaint be brought to the Church, but it's of fundamental importance to people who are abused that when they go to the relevant authority, their story is accepted and they have the opportunity to tell the whole of their story to a forum which they can have trust in and which will enable them then to pass, as it were, some of the burden to that institution which requires, in this case, that it report or that person report. Now, these are very significant issues. They're not small issues, they're significant issues. And at the moment we're, as I say, facing a situation where we can see a problem, but we do need assistance from the Church in what is the solution. And we rather thought that Mr. Jackson might be able to assist us in that respect. I understand the reason for compassion being extended to him. I have no difficulty with that. And for that reason I have not issued a summons requiring him to attend. But at the moment we face a serious issue which only the Church can help us with. Now, whether that needs a response now, I don't know, but we would like you to reflect upon that situation. The question I make at the moment is that if there is to be change, it's change that has to be ultimately sanctioned, if not directed by New York. Am I right?
Your Honour, ultimately it's a matter for submission, enables the branches to tailor these matters for individual cases, and that's part of what Mr. Spinks's evidence is about today, so that it may be that...
Well, I'm still at a loss, because as I understand it, the ultimate framework comes from New York.
No, Your Honour, the ultimate framework comes from the Scriptures, in the sense...
All right,
yeah.
but that as interpreted by New York.
Perhaps as interpreted, but also we would say as set down in the Scriptures, so that the structure may not be changeable. But
well, you see, that's a serious issue. And if the way the Scriptures are being interpreted and applied is creating additional trauma for people who are sexually abused by members of the Church, that's a serious problem.
Understood, Your Honour. I think that, again, ultimately it's a matter for submissions. I think our submission at the end of the day will be that the structure itself doesn't create or exacerbate the trauma that has been suffered. What is required is for the structure to be adapted to the individual person so as to ensure...
Well, that may be your submission, but I should put you on notice that that's not a submission which at the moment I think is going to deal with the problem we have.
Understood, Your Honour. And that's why perhaps at the end of all of the witnesses that are to come, if I can put it this way, that Your Honour's concerns will be hopefully addressed, but certainly to the extent to which they're not, I can assure Your Honour that the Jehovah's Witnesses will cooperate in addressing such matters.
Let me, I suppose, illustrate it. There's a second step in this, and that is the need to have the survivor confront the abuser.
Yes, Your Honour.
Now, all of our learning in the civil courts tells us that that process is likely to create, for some people, extraordinary trauma.
Yes, Your Honour.
And we need to look at that process. We had thought that perhaps Mr. Jackson might be able to help us with them, but if he can't,
Your Honour, no.
then so be it. Now, we had, I've forgotten her name, but the doctor last Friday.
Dr. Applewhite, Your Honour.
Yes. And you realise where her evidence ended up?
Yes, I do, Your Honour, yes.
In terms of the Church's processes?
Yes, Your Honour.
Although she came to say that they were good, the ultimate position, as we understand what she said, is they're flawed. And those flaws are the things that I'm talking to you about now.
Yes, I understand, Your Honour. We do understand, Your Honour, and obviously these matters have to be addressed and have to be addressed to assist the Commission. I don't wish to take up more of Your Honour's time now, and I'm conscious of the
anyway, if Mr. Jackson can't help, and
he can't, Your Honour.
Then there we are.
But Mr. O'Brien will be of assistance, Your Honour, and Mr. Spinks will be of assistance, Your Honour. Thank you, Your Honour.
Yes.
And in September 2005, you were appointed as a member of the governing body of the Jehovah's Witnesses.
That is correct.
And as I understand it, you've served continuously in that capacity since then.
That is correct as well.
And on the governing body, I understand that you are a member of both the writing and the teaching committees, is that right?
If I may be allowed to explain, each governing body member has a home committee where his office is based. So in my case, I work in the writing department under the writing committee, but then also I have the role of a consultant with the teaching committee as well as the personnel committee. But I do serve on the teaching and personnel committees.
Yes, so as I understand it, you serve on the writing, teaching and personnel committees, is that right?
That is correct.
Well, I want to take you back then to the scriptural basis for that. So you've referred to Matthew 18, verse 16, and as I understand it, and correct me if I'm wrong, that in turn really is a reference back to Deuteronomy 19, verse 15. In other words, what Jesus Christ was doing is referring back to that aspect of Mosaic law dealing with evidence.
He did quote, as he often did, from the Mosaic law, but he gave it Christian application.
So, but that is an element to be found in the Mosaic law as set out in Deuteronomy 19:15, is that right?
It is an element that is found in both the Old Testament and the New Testament.
Now, what I'm interested in is, and perhaps you can help me on this, is that why that applies to a case of sexual assault when clearly what was being addressed in the reference in Matthew that you gave us was not a question of sexual assault. You'll be familiar, and perhaps we can go to Deuteronomy 22, 23 to 27.
Deuteronomy 22, 23 to 27.
Page 304. So where it said that if a man is found lying down with a woman who is the wife of another man, both of them must die together. Now, let me just preface this. I'm not addressing the question of the stoning. I'm addressing the question of evidence. The man who lay down with the woman as well as the woman. Sorry, I read that badly. Both of them must die together. The man who lay down with the woman as well as the woman. So you must remove what is bad out of Israel. Then it says, if a virgin is engaged to a man and another man happens to meet her in the city and lies down with her, you should bring them both out to the gate of that city and stone them to death. The girl, because she did not scream in the city, and the man, because he humiliated the wife of his fellow man. So you must remove what is evil from your midst. And then the next example is the one I'm particularly interested in. If, however, the man happened to meet the engaged girl in the field, and the man overpowered her and lay down with her, and the man who lay down with her is to die by himself, and you must do nothing to the girl. The girl has not committed a sin deserving of death. This case is the same as when a man attacks his fellow man and murders him, for he happened to meet her in the field, and the engaged girl screamed, but there was no one to rescue her. So the point of this last example is that there's no second witness, is there? Because the woman's in the field, she screamed, but there was no one to rescue her. Do you accept that?
Could I explain, Mr. Stewart, that, you see, I think already under testimony, some of Jehovah's Witnesses have explained that the two witnesses needed can be, in some cases, the circumstances. I think, was it an example given?
I'll come to that, Mr. Jackson.
Okay, so
we'll get through this a lot quicker and easier if we just address it one step at a time. So, the present step.
So the answer to your question?
The present step is this: is that in that example you accept it's a case where there was no other witness beyond the woman herself.
There was no other witness except the woman herself, but added to that were the circumstances.
Yes, well, the circumstances were that she was raped in the field.
Mm-hmm. Yes, but they were circumstances.
And it was sufficient, there being only one witness, it was nevertheless sufficient for the conclusion that the man should be stoned to death.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Now, is it...
I think we're agreeing on the point.
Yes, is it not the case that had Jesus been asked about a case of sexual abuse, he may have referred back to this part of Deuteronomy and said that it's not required to have two witnesses.
I certainly would like to ask Jesus that, and I can't at the moment. I hope to in the future. But that's a hypothetical question, which if we had an answer, then we could support what you said.
Well, it's hypothetical in a sense, but really what I'm driving at is the scriptural basis, and you the scholar, I'm not, is the scriptural basis to the two-witness rule really so solid, or is there not space for your governing body to recognize that in cases of sexual abuse it need not apply?
Again, if I could just mention the fact that we've already acknowledged that circumstances can also be one of the witnesses.
Well, I'll come to that, but my question is a different one. It's whether the scriptural basis to the two-witness rule in relation to cases of sexual abuse has a proper foundation.
We believe it does because of the number of times that principle is emphasized in the scriptures.
This article will be studied during the week of January 9th through 15th. Do you highly esteem Jehovah's own book? Paragraph 9, question. What is the only channel that is being used to help us understand God's Word? Some may feel that they can interpret the Bible on their own. However, Jesus has appointed the faithful slave to be the only channel for dispensing spiritual food.
And do you see yourselves as Jehovah God's spokespeople on earth?
That, I think, would seem to be quite presumptuous to say that we are the only spokesperson that God is using.
Since 1919, the glorified Jesus Christ has been using that slave to help his followers understand God's own book and heed its directives. By obeying the instructions found in the Bible, we promote cleanness, peace, and unity in the congregation. Each one of us does well to ask himself, am I loyal to the channel that Jesus is using today?
That, I think, would seem to be quite presumptuous to say that we are the only spokesperson that God is using.
KM907 question box.
Does the faithful and discreet slave endorse independent groups of witnesses who meet together to engage in scriptural research or debate? No, it does not.
What we view ourselves as the guardians of doctrine, the guardians of doctrine, the guardians of doctrine.
We're back with NBC News In Depth tonight, an exclusive investigation into yet another religious organization hit with sexual abuse allegations. The Jehovah's Witnesses have settled 9 lawsuits alleging church policies protected men who abused children for many years. In settling, the church did not acknowledge wrongdoing. Now, evidence has surfaced that leaders did know about some of the men, but apparently never informed authorities. Our senior investigative correspondent, Lisa Myers, has our exclusive report tonight in depth.
Frederick McLean is among the country's most wanted fugitives, accused of molesting children for almost a decade.
His typical victims were young girls, I think starting around 5 or 6 years old.
Authorities say McLean, who restored race cars, was a respected leader in this congregation of Jehovah's Witnesses.
His role in the church was significant because we believe that his participation in the church gave him access to his victims.
The Jehovah's Witnesses recently agreed to pay to settle a lawsuit that alleged the church knew or should have known McLean was a pedophile. One of 9 similar cases church headquarters settled without admitting wrongdoing.
But internal church records now coming to light in those lawsuits show that the church knew for years that some prominent members were sexually abusing children and did little.
Example, James Henderson. Documents showed the church knew he was abusing kids as early as the 1970s and stripped him of his leadership role for a while, but apparently never alerted police. He was finally arrested in 1994 and went to prison, having molested children for 2 decades. Another church leader, Alvin Hurd, confessed to the church in 1981 that he'd abused 3 children, ages 5, 9, and 11. His local congregation kicked him out and alerted church headquarters. But again, the church apparently never notified police. Hurd, now in prison, admits he molested other children until 2003.
The policies and procedures enacted by Jehovah's Witnesses protect pedophiles rather than protect the children.
She says the church prefers to keep an abuser's confession confidential, treating abuse more as a sin than as a crime.
They do not report child abuse to the authorities unless it's mandated by a state for the clergy to do so.
The church declined to speak on camera, but in a statement wrote that it does not condone or protect child molesters, that cases within the church are rare, that members have the right to report the crime to authorities, and that church elders comply with child abuse reporting laws. But not all states require clergy to report child sexual abuse. That means some abusers get caught only if victims finally come forward, like Frederick McLean's accusers, who now want this alleged molester taken off the streets. Lisa Myers, NBC News.
If, however, the man happened to meet the engaged girl in the field, and the man overpowered her and lay down with her, and the man who lay down with her is to die by himself, and you must do nothing to the girl. The girl has not committed a sin deserving of death. This case is the same as when a man attacks his fellow man and murders him. For he happens.
And what about telling other authorities? Are you aware of your obligations if someone tells you of a serious allegation of sexual assault?
Well, we don't report it to the police. I think we encourage them to do that, but we give them the assistance to do that if they need that.
Church elders could now face criminal charges for concealing the abuse. The Commission also heard that the church only believed victims if the alleged abuser confessed or there were 2 witnesses.
The requirement that there be 2 or more witnesses has prevented at least 125 allegations of child sexual abuse from proceeding to a judicial committee.